So let's begin today's event with a brief learning. Again, there's a brief learning on the principle of impartiality, and then we're going to have a discussion. This series is part of PHAP's online learning series on humanitarian law and policy. For those of you who are PHAP members and are participating in the association's continuing learning credits program, please watch the screen and listen for the numerical code, which I will give you at the end of the session. You'll need this code to access the assessment and then to earn your credit for the session. Finally, what are the learning objectives today? Well, just basically, let's try and understand the core principle of humanity, both in its definition and its implementation. And I think what's going to help us do that is gaining knowledge of examples of the practical implications of impartiality, and really having a better understanding of the challenges in the real world of translating this principle into operations. And finally, we want, I think our speaker is from the ICRC, and so we hope that you'll gain a familiarity with the role impartiality plays within the Red Cross Red Crescent movement as both a goal and as a tool. So to help accomplish these objectives today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest expert for this presentation, Jeremy Labbé. Jeremy works at the ICRC in Geneva. He's the head of project for a project called Principles Guiding Humanitarian Action. Jeremy started his humanitarian career with the ICRC. He's worked both in headquarters in the field, and he also spent some time at the International Peace Institute. One particular point of focus of Jeremy's work has been the adaptation of the international humanitarian system to a changing world, and hence the relevance of the humanitarian principles. I think that's a great place to start for this discussion on impartiality. Welcome, Jeremy, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this introduction. I hope that everybody can hear me properly. Let me apologize in the first place for my strong French accent. I hope it will not be a disturbance or a problem for you to understand. I must also say that I'm very glad to be back on this PHAP platform. Indeed, I participated earlier this year to such a webinar on neutrality, and I'm very glad to be back here to discuss about impartiality this time, probably an even more fundamental principle than neutrality, but we'll get back to this. So I see that my presentation is uploaded, so I guess that we can get started. Maybe within the 15 to 20 minutes allotted to me, I would like to come back first on the definition of impartiality, what we mean with this principle. I know that it was tackled already a few weeks back by Mark when you did this webinar on the 4 humanitarian principles. But still, I think it is worth to get back to this. Then second, I will look at what I call the operationalization of impartiality. And here I would like to focus more on what it means in practice and how the ICRC sees this principle of impartiality and uses it and implement it in its practice. And last, I will touch upon some of the concrete challenges to impartiality before sharing with you a few conclusions. So let's get starting with the definition. Let me check if this works. Yes. So maybe before getting into the definition, a very quick historical overview of impartiality in modern humanitarianism. As most of you know, and as Mark mentioned it a few weeks back, I think this notion of impartiality, this principle of impartiality, can be traced back to 1859 and the Battle of Solferino, which is at the origin of the Red Cross. I don't want to go through history of the Red Cross, but just to emphasize that in essence, this idea of impartiality, and we'll get back to what impartiality means, but was there on the battlefield of Solferino in 1859 when Henri Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, saw the scale of destruction and decided to mobilize volunteers in neighboring villages in Solferino, in this little town in northern Italy, to provide aid to all the wounded soldiers on the battlefield, regardless of the side they belong to. And in the ensuing years, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and the ICRC in the first place have tried to formalize the principles guiding our action on several occasions, and impartiality always came back as this guiding principle throughout. But it's not until 1965 in Vienna at the 20th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement that the principle of impartiality was formalized as we know it today. And here I get to the definition that you see on your screen in front of you. You can see two different definitions. One is the one on top is the Red Cross, Red Crescent definition. This definition adopted 50 years ago, and I emphasize here that I seize this opportunity to stress that we celebrate this year the 50th anniversary of the adoption of those fundamental principles. And then but this definition developed 50 years ago was also largely influenced the broader humanitarian sector. And indeed, we saw the notion and the principle of impartiality appear in UN General Assembly Resolution 46182 adopted in 1991. It was used again in the Code of Conduct for international non-governmental organizations and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement in disaster relief, in the sphere guidelines, and so on and so forth. So the definition, the Red Cross, Red Crescent definition is that the movement makes no discrimination as to nationality, race, religious beliefs, class, or political opinions. It endeavors to relieve the suffering of individuals, being guided solely by their needs and to give priority to the most urgent cases of distress. And then if you look at the OCHA definition, what you might notice is that, well, this is basically very similar. And there are two main components in the definition of impartiality on which we should come back, which is this non-discrimination aspect and the needs-based aspect. But we will get back to this. Maybe one difference that you might have seen here, if you look carefully at those two definitions, is that gender doesn't appear in the Red Cross, Red Crescent definition, but needless to say that it is indeed considered as I mean, we shouldn't do any arbitrary discrimination based on gender, but we will see later on that, however, the specific vulnerabilities linked to the gender must be considered and addressed in light of the principle of impartiality. But we will get back to this. Now, I'd like to talk briefly about those fundamental principles of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement that were adopted 50 years ago, just to emphasize the place that impartiality has within those principles. And here I hope that I will not confuse anybody, because when we talk about the fundamental principles of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we talk about 7 principles. When we talk about the humanitarian principles that the broader humanitarian sector has broadly embraced, we talk about the first 4 principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. But obviously in this discussion, I will talk about impartiality the way we understand it within the ICRC and the Red Cross movement. So what I want to show here with this pyramid is that impartiality is part of a broader set of principles that do not all have the same value and the same finality, let's put it that way. Impartiality in our view, directly flows from this overarching principle of humanity that drive humanitarian action, and which was discussed at length last week with Hugo Slim. So impartiality flows from humanity because this is this idea of non-discrimination between human beings that is embodied in this principle of impartiality. And this is why we consider that those two principles of humanity and impartiality belong to the domain of goals. Those two principles are an end in itself. This is really what drives humanitarian action, as opposed to the principles of neutrality and independence, which we see as more operational principles. Those are tools that that enable us to deliver impartial humanitarian action, even in the most adverse and polarized circumstances of conflict. Which doesn't make them less important, but simply they have a different finality or a different function. And then we will not talk too much about the last three principles of voluntary service, unity, and universality, because these are specific to the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. Yet, I would like to make just one point about these principles, is that in this Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, some of the participants to this webinar belong to this movement. Those three principles that belong to the organizational field are what give the institutional foundations to the movement and to the different entities of the movement: Red Cross, Red Crescent National Societies, the ICRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, to develop an impartial, neutral, and independent humanitarian action. And for instance, unity, which says that all national societies should be one per state, should cover the entire territory of this state, and should be open to all within that state, meaning to all ethnicities, all religions, all political sensibilities, is critical to enable those national societies to deliver impartial aid throughout a given territory. Now, let's move on to the two main aspects of impartiality. Basically, we can see in this, as I already mentioned, there are two different sub-principles within this principle of impartiality. One is non-discrimination. This is this part that flows directly from the principle of humanity. No discrimination as to nationality, race, religious beliefs, class, gender, political opinions. It belongs to the domain of goals, properly speaking, as I already mentioned before. But the other aspect of impartiality is this idea of proportionality, which is this the fact that humanitarian action should be guided solely by the needs of affected people, and we should give priority to the most urgent or the most severe cases of distress. So here we are already entering in the domain of tools somehow, because indeed this with those two aspects, those two components, impartiality, the principle of impartiality recognizes that even though organizations want to address, humanitarian organizations want to address needs without any discrimination, not any single organization is in a position to do that in a comprehensive manner due to limited resources, limited human resources, financial resources, limited skills at times. And therefore, there must be a way to discriminate, since we can hardly cover all needs. And the way to discriminate is through an objective assessment of needs. So regardless of nationality, race, religious beliefs, and so on and so forth, but really just based on the severity and the urgency of needs. It is in that way that we enter here into the domain of tools. maybe one last thing that we have that is important to mention under the definition of impartiality is that impartiality is enshrined and enshrined in international humanitarian law. Indeed, as early as 1949, when this principle of impartiality wasn't even formally defined, since it was only defined in 1965, I mentioned it before, the Geneva Conventions were already recognizing this character to humanitarian action. And here I'm reading this Article 3 of the common to the 4 Geneva Conventions, which says that an impartial humanitarian body, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, may offer its services to the parties to the conflict. Later on, in 1977, the centrality of impartiality was confirmed again through the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention. And here I'm reading again Article 70 of the first additional protocol, which says that relief actions which are humanitarian and impartial in character and conducted without any adverse distinctions should be undertaken subject to the agreement of the parties concerned in such relief actions. What is important to remember here is that impartiality is basically not an option for humanitarian organizations. It is what makes humanitarian action acceptable to states in situations of conflict. And this is, we can argue that this is probably the very condition why they accepted that, that they should consider seriously offer of services of humanitarian organizations that are impartial, and that they should facilitate this aid and shouldn't consider it as an interference with their internal affairs or with the politics of a given conflict. So impartiality is critical for humanitarian action, and it's not really an option, but it is part and parcel of what humanitarian action is. Now, I would like to move on to the operationalization of impartiality. And first, maybe look at impartiality at 3 different levels. Indeed, we can, as I said, this notion of impartiality is to deliver, means to deliver aid based on needs only, deliver aid without any discrimination to affected people. But we can look at this, this principle at 3 different levels. At the macro level, which is the ability of humanitarian organizations to cover needs at the global level, to address needs coming from emerging crises, but also not to forget needs coming from arising from so-called forgotten conflicts. And there is this notion that the global humanitarian systems or all humanitarian actors should collectively be able to address those needs impartially at the macro level wherever they are. Then you can look at impartiality at the crisis level or the country level, and which is the ability to address the most urgent needs in a given crisis, which might include, in a situation of conflict, to be able to access and to deliver aid to those affected communities that might be on the other side of a front line, that might be in an area controlled by a rebel group. And this is where really the principles of independence and neutrality that will be discussed in future webinars are really getting into the picture and are of paramount importance in order to navigate those complex circumstances and to be accepted by all parties in a given conflict, to cross lines in order to deliver impartial aid to the most vulnerable communities and people across the different front lines in a given context. And then at the micro level, and I would argue that this is really the bottom line of what we should understand by humanitarian action. At the micro level, every organization should be non-discriminatory and need-based in the projects it is undertaking in a given geographic area, in this healthcare center that this medical organization might be managing. And here I would argue, coming back to the principles of neutrality and independence, that those two principles are maybe less critical in those kind of circumstances, because one could consider an organization that is active only, let's say, in a government-held area of a country at war, that is carrying out some activities only in a hospital, in this government-controlled area, which still can be impartial in the way it delivers its services, meaning that it would provide the aid based only on the urgency and the severity of needs, and that it would take it as its duty, its responsibility, to therefore treat a rebel fighter, for instance, that would come into this particular hospital or health center. So this is what I call impartiality at the micro level. Now, let's move on to ICRC's practice of impartiality. As I mentioned before, impartiality requires being able to objectively assess needs. It needs to be need-based, and therefore, in our view, it is of paramount importance to work in proximity with affected people, to be able to listen to them, to listen to their problem, not only material problem, but problems in terms of safety, of security, somehow their aspirations as well. So what I want to say here, I guess, is that impartiality is not just about the collection of data, but it's really about establishing this human relationship with the communities we serve in order to understand their needs accurately and, as much as possible, holistically. This requires to have access to this population, which requires to be accepted by the gatekeepers, by the different stakeholders in a given context, being the authorities or religious leaders or community leaders in general, which once again shows the importance of the other principles of neutrality and independence. And I would argue that this proximity and this ability to deliver assistance and protection that is relevant to people's needs in line with the principle of impartiality is in itself a driver of accountability. If you are not in a position to deliver relevant assistance or protection to people, you might lose this acceptance and in turn not be able to deliver aid to those communities anymore. Another aspect of the ICRC's practice of impartiality is that it very much relies on the universality of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Indeed, I would argue that our ambition within the ICRC and the broader Red Cross movement is to be impartial at the three levels that I have described before, meaning the macro level, globally, the crisis level, across front lines, to put it simply, and the micro level. And this Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and the work we do together with Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies is what enables us to have this, to act impartially at those three levels. Indeed, we are present through national societies in 189 countries, but also we work with privileged actors, those national societies that are anchored in in their local and national context, and who have a comparative advantage or an added value on us, which is this ability to accurately understand the cultural or religious sensitivities that are also so important to take into account when we talk about impartiality. And there is a great deal of complementarity between the different components of the movement in that respect, which enable us or contribute to impartial humanitarian action at the global, national, and local level. Then our understanding of impartiality is also about filling what I call the vulnerability gap. Our ambition here is also to be able to address the needs of the most vulnerable, those that are falling through the cracks of the international aid response. And in that respect, coordination with other actors is crucial for impartiality. As you all know, some actors are, some humanitarian actors or agencies have specializations in terms of the population whose needs they want to address, just like such as children, or well, we have one of the co-panelists in today's discussion is from Help Age International that specializes in addressing the needs of elderly people, and this is all very necessary because this is what enables us as a humanitarian ecosystem to address the needs, the specific needs of specifically vulnerable categories of the population in a relevant manner. However, those different actors might not be able to address the same needs, and this is where it is indeed really important to be aware of one's own limitations as an organization, and to be aware of the complementarity of other actors in achieving this global impartiality. And finally, impartiality and protection work. I think I already mentioned it before, but impartiality, in our view, is certainly not only about material assistance, about providing healthcare or providing food or shelter to those in need in a relevant manner and in a proportional manner. But it is also about protection. And here I would like to refer to a document which is called the Professional Standards for Protection Work, which was developed by the ICRC, which basically puts impartiality at the center of all protection work, even the protection work that is carried out by human rights actors, arguably even protection work that is carried out by peacekeepers when it comes to the protection of civilians within United Nations peacekeeping missions. Impartiality is therefore central, in our view, also to the protection work in general, regardless of the actor that is delivering this this protection work. Now, and we are approaching the end of this presentation, I would like to stop quickly on some of the challenges to impartiality, starting with the very rejection of the notion of humanity. This idea that people's needs should be addressed regardless of their political deeds, regardless of their religion, regardless of the side they take in a particular conflict, or even regardless of yes, what they did in the past, is not necessarily accepted by all. And as as international relations are increasingly polarized today, and this is also the very nature of every conflict to be polarized and radicalized. This notion of impartiality, of aid based on needs only, is not always shouldn't be taken as granted. And and we face indeed difficulties to justify at times that we should look at the primary identity of any human being and believe in this radical equality of all human beings. Then another challenge to impartiality is financial independence or funding constraints. Indeed, the dependence of organizations, to humanitarian organizations in general, to funding from institutional donors may challenge this principle of impartiality. We have to recognize that that donors, institutional donors, have their own political priorities, and that they tend to distribute the funding according to those political priorities. A lot of donors do have some systems in place to guarantee an impartial distribution of the funding, and here I can think about the European Commission, for instance, that has a very clear system in place, or the Swiss government, or a number of other governments. But those systems are also sometimes undermined by the realpolitik, and therefore it is crucial for humanitarian organizations to maintain a degree of financial independence in order to deliver impartial aid. And this goes through negotiating with donors unearmarked funding, for instance. This is what, within the ASRC, what we really try to do in our interactions with any donor, to diversify the sources of funding. And we have the example of MSF that relies for a large majority on individual private funding, which gives it a greater independence and therefore a greater ability maybe to remain impartial, and the importance also of multi-year funding, not to be, as much as possible, not to be blocked by a funding that must be renewed year on year, but rather to be agreed like for several years in a row. Access and security constraints are obviously a huge challenge to the impartial delivery of aid. As I mentioned before, our understanding of impartiality is very much linked to the proximity we can have with affected populations in order to assess independently their needs, in order to understand what they need. And in that respect, access and security constraints are a huge obstacle to this impartial delivery of aid. It requires, in that respect, a strict application of the principles of independence and neutrality, but those principles are also challenged by the politicization of aid, either through the use of hearts and minds tactics by some of the belligerents in different conflicts. This is challenged also by stabilization or integrated approaches that bring together development, political, and security and humanitarian approaches in order to support our government or to stabilize some regions or some countries. It is challenged by counterterrorism policies, but also by the proliferation of aid and relief factors that are not all acting according to the same modalities, and tend to blur the lines between the motivations of different actors. And finally, I will address another challenge to impartiality, which is a challenge inherent to the humanitarian principles, which is how impartiality can be at times in contradiction with neutrality. Indeed, a rigid or dogmatic application of the principle of impartiality, consisting, for instance, in delivering aid to one particular community without taking into account the sensitivities of other communities around that, that have some needs, maybe less urgent, but that see you as an organization go through their village to bring some food or any other assistance to the neighboring community, can create resentment, can create misunderstandings, which can result in well, in increasing tensions in between communities, which can result in the community that feels ignored, to undermine, to put obstacles on your organization and the access of your organization to the neighboring community. And therefore, what is important when in order to implement this principle of impartiality is to look at it with this neutrality lens, to understand how impartial humanitarian aid can be perceived by some organizations that, by some communities, sorry, that are not the direct beneficiaries of this aid. And last but not least, I would like to stop quickly on both the opportunities and the challenges created by new technologies. Indeed, new technologies offer opportunities to overcome access and security constraints through the use of the internet, for instance, mobile phone, that enable organizations to reach out to affected communities, even though they are not physically present due to access or security constraints. But on the other hand, we have to use these new technologies in a very sensible manner, because this might create also some gaps. We shouldn't overly rely on new technologies and realize, for instance, that some communities might be left out of those technologies, of the use of cell phone or of internet, and therefore we might create some new vulnerabilities if we put all our eggs in the same basket, so to say, and use those new technologies in with a lack of sensibility. I think I have talked long enough, and it is time to conclude. And so, in conclusion, I would like to emphasize three key aspects that I hope were clear in this short presentation, which is first the fact that impartiality provides both a moral compass, but also a practical tool to humanitarian action. It is both an end, it is both a goal, and but it's also a way to deliver aid and to cope with the limitations that each organization has. Secondly, impartiality is the bottom line for humanitarian action. As I mentioned, it is recognized, it is this principle is recognized in international humanitarian law, and it is a critical aspect. It is part of the identity of humanitarian actors and what humanitarian action is. And the very bottom line is that every organization should be able to deliver impartial aid, at the very least, at the micro level that I have described before. And last but not least, it is important to keep in mind the complementarity of humanitarian actors in achieving collectively impartial humanitarian aid. Indeed, not all actors might be able to achieve impartiality at all three levels that I have described before. And this is okay, as long as the aid is non-discriminatory and needs-based. Some might have a deficit of neutrality and independence, for instance, which creates difficulties to access to the most vulnerable in all places in a given crisis, and makes them unable to deliver aid across front lines. But the importance is to then to avoid to claim being neutral and independent when you have limitations in that respect, to be more honest about the limitations of each actor and to be aware of the complementarity of others in order to achieve impartiality at all three levels in a collective manner. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy now to take up any question you might have.
That was great, Jeremy. That was really great, very clear. Thank you very much. It's also interesting that you mentioned that impartiality is 50 years old this year. I think in our humanitarian world where everything changes so quickly, that endurance says something about the importance of the principle. Before moving on to our panel discussion, I'd like to just know if there are any questions for clarification purposes. You can send them in via the link we described earlier. We've got a few already, Jeremy, and I'd like to just run these by you. You've touched on a number of things, and in particular, you were talking about the different levels at which you look at impartiality, sort of the global level, the macro level, the crisis level, and the micro level. And Reza in Jordan asks, well, does that mean that a small organization just working in one neighborhood can still claim to be impartial even if they're really not able, they don't have the capacity to work across the whole country? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. I think we must very much take into account that not all organizations have the resources, the means to achieve impartiality at the global level. Let's put it that way. In that respect, most national or local organizations would be excluded from this humanitarian sector because if they focus their activities at the national or local level, they are by definition not in a position to address needs at the global level in a kind of holistic manner and fully impartial manner at the global level. The same thing goes for, yes, for local organizations that might not have the, well, the ambition to extend our activities in the entire country. But what we would expect at the very least is that indeed, at the level of their district, at the level of their neighborhood, or in the different projects and programs that they might run, that they do so without any discrimination other than the actual and objectively assessed vulnerabilities of the people they serve.
Good. Okay, thank you for that. Another question comes in from Anne in Israel, who asks, well, who decides if an organization is impartial or not? So, yeah, who's the judge here, Jeremy?
Oh, that's a good question, and certainly not an easy one. Well, I guess there is not one judge, but certainly a multiplicity of judges in that respect. Certainly a lot of donors who believe in this notion of impartial humanitarian action can play the role of judge and would sanction an organization that is not impartial by simply withdrawing any funding. But there are a number of initiatives as well, sectoral initiatives within the humanitarian sector that attempt to not to judge whether an organization is impartial or not, but rather to encourage organizations who join a given initiative, and I'm thinking here about the core humanitarian standard, for instance, the CHS, to encourage them to improve their ability to deliver impartial aid by proposing a number of standards that those organizations should respect and should live up to, so I guess it is, and then overall I guess the final judge is certainly the communities that we help.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that in the end, and also the armed actors in the area. You know, I always found in my work with MSF that if they do not believe you're acting impartially, you will hear it from them very quickly. Have one more question, just for clarification, from Zacharias Asefa in Ethiopia. And you described, Jeremy, very well how, you know, impartiality is a requirement for humanitarian organizations. What he's wondering is if there are ways in which the principle of impartiality is unique to the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, or are there ways in which it's particular to Red Cross, Red Crescent rather than everybody?
I would say yes and no. I guess it's a non-answer, but well, let me explain. No, probably because, as I mentioned before, this principle of impartiality, which was maybe developed or formalized or defined in the first place within the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, has been broadly embraced by all humanitarian actors. It is enshrined in international humanitarian law, as much as there are some divergences on the interpretations of the humanitarian principles in general. I'm thinking in particular about neutrality, which is certainly the most contested. I think there is a relatively large consensus on what impartiality means. But yes, there might be a particular interpretation of impartiality which is unique to the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement to some extent, which is this ambition that I mentioned before to be impartial at all three levels. And this is the greatness of this movement. This is why it was developed the way it has been developed, meaning that we're talking about three entities: the International Committee of the Red Cross, that has a specific mandate to act in situations of armed conflict; the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies that work, that support national societies, the third entity, to develop their capacities and help them to coordinate, in particular when responding to natural disasters. And then this third component, which is critical, and which are the 189 national societies of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent around the world that enable this movement to have this truly universal reach and this truly globally impartial action.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe I've got one quick question for clarification, just came in from Solomon in Ethiopia. And in your presentation, when you were talking about the principles, you mentioned 7 principles in the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and you added also voluntary action, unity, and universality. And I think we just wanted a clarification that what do you mean when you say that those belong to the RCRC? I don't think you mean you own them exclusively, do you?
I didn't mean that they belong to the ICRC, to the International Committee of the Red Cross, but to the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. I mean, this idea of voluntary service, this spirit of disinterested aid, selfless service to the others is certainly not unique to the movement. Unity, I mean, there are certainly a whole range of other actors that see that as a principle in their own organization. And here I'm not even thinking about only the humanitarian sector, but maybe in the private sector, I don't know. Universality is certainly shared by a number of factors in terms of this aspiration to the universality of values. But the way they are integrated, the way they are part of those 7 fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and the way they are understood within, is very specific to the movement. And once again, unity, which I mentioned before, we understand it as one national society per country, which covers the entire territory of its country and which is open to all. So it's a very specific definition and understanding of this principle, which makes those 7 principles like a coherent lot, and where not one single principle can be used independently from the others, if you wish.
Yeah, no, I think that was a very good explanation, that there's a particular meaning assigned to it and a particular interrelationship assigned to it within the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and its interrelationship with the other principles. With that, I think we're going to try and move on towards the next part of our discussion, and that is the panel discussion. If you are taking part in this as part of your continuous learning credits, you will have to note down the assessment code on your screen now. That's 2431. And that allows you to complete these assessments later. So you're going to have to enter that code. Another point to be made is that all the materials and resources related to today's event are available at the link you see now on the screen before you. So the recording will be processed and it should be up within a few hours after this discussion ends, and it'll be posted there. It would also be great if you could tweet it out there and get your friends to take a look at it, or other people in the organization who weren't able to participate today. So I would like to move to the panel discussion, which I think we'll be able to draw on Jeremy's excellent session, and we'll continue to examine these pragmatic sides of the principle of impartiality and its operational implications. So with that in mind, let me introduce the rest of the panelists. We're very glad today to have Toby Porter with us. Toby is the CEO of HelpAge International, and Toby has worked his entire career as a humanitarian and development worker. He's worked with Merlin, Oxfam, USAID, FuseNet Project. He's also held senior positions with Save the Children UK and Save the Children in India. Secondly, we have Jules Frost. Jules is a senior advisor for civil, military, and police relations for World Vision International. Jules has 21 years of experience in the management, operations, fundraising, advocacy for around child-focused agencies, including both complex humanitarian emergencies, but also natural disasters. And she's worked in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and I think we're really, really lucky to have Jules and Toby, and Jeremy, of course, will join us for the panel discussion. I want to make one quick pit stop before going on to the panel discussion, and what I thought would be interesting is to engage with you, the participants, in a quick decision-making exercise. So you'll see a poll in front of you now on the screen, and basically pretend you're the head of mission. What would you do in these circumstances? So we're going to do 2 of these. This is the first one. I really hope you'll take a minute to read that and respond. So while you're reading that, I mean, think about the very, very real situation where you've got, an established project working with a community, and I think it's a very tough decision. Then, what do how do you deal with that community afterwards? And it's something we're going to get back to in talking with our panelists. It might be, you might think, how difficult, how easy or difficult might it be to leave that community and go to another community where needs are greater? On the other hand, there are advantages to remaining in a community where you already have a certain degree of familiarity with a network, where you understand the local dynamics. So it's I can see that it's so far a bit split, which is good. Why don't we leave this up there for about another 15 seconds if people could take a look at it. We've got 60-some voters. Come on, the rest of you, make a choice. And you're the head of mission, you have to make a decision. Okay, it's pretty close, but there seems to be a bit of a favor for the idea of staying in and delivering the assistance where you have established programming. Why don't we move on to the next one, Marcus? So you can see that here again, what we're getting at is something that Jeremy raised, and that was the issue of specialization. And you're in a situation again where what the competency of your organization is able to do is respond to children, but it is the elderly in this particular population that need help. So what do you do? A really good situation that shows this or exemplifies this, another is just Ebola. When the Ebola crisis hit, what about all those organizations that aren't medically specialized, and yet the needs were overwhelmingly medical? And we did see quite a number of organizations take up take up activities that were not part of their normal specialization. Not that I'm trying to convince you one way or the other here. Seems to be a much more clear decision here in terms of keeping with the organizational specialization. And I think there's quite some issues there. Whether you're able to, what is your responsibility in terms of your professional skills? You don't want to be an amateur just doing something else. But then again, what about this principle of impartiality? And why don't we leave both of these up there for just a little bit longer? Okay. I think with that, why don't we take those down and we'll move on to our discussion. I have a feeling I was going to start with Toby, and I have a feeling that having seen that question right there, I think that probably Toby is something that will speak to your experience with HelpAge. But first, Toby, you and I were talking yesterday, and you said something I thought was really interesting. What you said was that you don't think you hear people talking about impartiality as much as they used to, that it is a topic less and less. And I'm wondering, I thought that was really interesting. I'm wondering if maybe you could just explain a little bit what you meant by that.
Well, as you kindly introduced me, Mark, and hello to everybody listening in. I've worked in humanitarian assistance since 1993, and I just have the impression that over the last few years, the volume of the debate around impartiality across the humanitarian sector has dropped, and there may be a combination of reasons for that. It might be that after 10 or 15 years of Western humanitarian agencies operating in conflicts where Western belligerents were present, much more so than the corresponding 20 years, that the game is up, if you like, for mainstream humanitarian agencies to protest impartiality, if you like. The other hypothesis is that some of the nature, the nature of the conflict in Syria and the nature of some of the non-state actors and some of the atrocious crimes that have been perpetrated against humanitarian aid workers have shown, beyond any doubt that that for many non-state actors in the Syrian crisis, there is absolutely no space to have a debate around humanitarian impartiality. It may be that there are other priorities for the sector over the last couple of years. It may be that humanitarian assistance has that generally the trend which I think we've seen across our sector in a whole, whereby the larger agencies are still very much mission driven, but the metrics and often the analysis seems to be now about finance and size and scale, and perhaps less about principles and values. So those would just be some of those areas. It's a very complex area, Mark, but I would say that a challenge to all of us in the humanitarian community is, if impartiality matters to us, are we doing enough, and particularly in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit, are we doing enough to really demonstrate that this is still an absolutely overarching value to the humanitarian sector?
Toby, thank you for that. In looking at Jeremy's explanation of impartiality, where he talks about the two sides of it, sort of non-discrimination, but also the proportionality side, delivering aid to those most in need. do you think that what you've just been talking about, you know, sort of a watering down with impartiality, is it affecting both of those parts? Is it affecting one more than the other? Um, you know, I've seen some, yeah, some concerns out there that basically people, organizations are finding people in need, and that's enough to get a contract, and then they just serve those needs without really looking for people who might be most in need, and therefore honoring that idea of proportionality. Is that your read on it too?
I think that's again part of it. I think proportionality is a very important concept. I think if you take a global look of humanitarian emergencies, I remember I did a study looking at the CAP appeal for OCHA in 2002, and even then, what it showed was that over a 15-year period, every year except for one, the response to the biggest two humanitarian emergency CAP appeals every year outweighed all the other appeals put together. And I think the nature of humanitarianism, which is a good thing, how it's driven by compassion, by awareness, by empathy, by identity, you do often see publics and governments reacting in the same way, and then you ended up with the situation of you know, funds migrating disproportionately to some crises and less to others. I also think it's important to qualify those remarks by the fact that in my career, with the possible exception of some of the refugee camps in Albania from refugees from Kosovo in 1999, I've never personally felt in an environment. There was, of course, the tsunami as well, which I would say this would be the second example. Those would be the only two cases where I felt there were a disproportionate level of resources given the as compared to the needs of affected populations. The much more common situation is agencies forced to choose between how thinly they can spread themselves.
Yes.
I still think I'm an optimist. I still think the values of most humanitarians and most humanitarian agencies are very well motivated, and that idea of agencies just turning up to a place to get their contract and then say, well, that's kind of done what we've come for. I don't personally see that much in the sector, which is good because I think I'd want to leave it if it was.
That is good that you're still an optimist. Toby, I'm going to come back. We've used the polls, and I really want to get at this, get a little bit more into this question around specialization. And but first, I want to take this question over to Jules that we've been talking about. And just curious, Jules, you've heard Toby talk a little bit about, maybe just a little less attention being paid to impartiality as what he remembers from before. And I'm just curious if you have a similar sense from your years of work in the movement. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here with you all today, and I appreciate what Toby has shared. However, I might have a slight disagreement with that if I'm looking at it comprehensively. I think maybe at the micro level, meaning at a program or a project level, perhaps we're not having the kind of discussions about impartiality that we used to. And I would like to pose that as perhaps evidence of mainstreaming impartiality to where we're getting better at looking for the most vulnerable at a project level. However, I find that right now, it seems to me at a crisis level, and then potentially also at a macro level, that in the platforms where I'm working or the discussions I'm having in various places, is we are struggling with the issue of impartiality. And maybe we can take Syria as an example, where some of the agencies were able to register into Damascus. Others have not been able to. Some are working in the northern parts of Syria and aren't able to then be in Damascus. Those that were in both have been kicked out of parts. And through that whole process of trying to get humanitarian assistance and protection to those most vulnerable, we've really been striving, I think, to ensure impartiality in what we're doing. And I know for myself, I really was struggling for a while with World Vision's programming to say, are we truly impartial if we can't work on both sides because of limited or constrained access by the parties that control the territory. And I was really encouraged to hear what Jeremy had to say, that what is important when you don't have access is to ensure that you're being impartial where you are present. And that helped me to work through that for our own organization. So I believe that we're still struggling with it. It is a topic of discussion. And I believe the part, if we think back to the principle of humanity, that, I mean, humanity in action is basically guided by impartiality. And if we're not talking about it, then we should be really concerned. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and we can go maybe a bit further on that if there's time.
No, I think you've raised a really interesting point related to, yeah, whether it's for security reasons, it might also be a perception of a lack of neutrality. It could also be a lack of financial independence. There are various reasons why agencies and NGOs can't get to certain territories. And I'm wondering, you know, how has World Vision struggled with that? It seems in Syria that you've tried and you recognize the situation, but you know that it is not possible to go where there are the people are most in need. What about some other context? How do you internally in the organization, you know, discuss what's good enough in terms of where you can get to, and at what point do you simply try and concentrate to do the best you can where you are?
Well, I think there's never probably an end state on that. And so it's the continuing seeking and striving to obtain access, but also at the same time recognizing that at certain points you need to direct your energies where you can access a population. So I think if we go back, can we truly be impartial if we can't be everywhere? Well, as we've said, yes, in those localities, but that isn't quite enough. And so I think simultaneously, World Vision, we attempt to work with others or partners who can access localities that we ourselves can't. Plus, we as a multi-mandated organization, when we can't obtain access, we'll hit hard with an advocacy strategy, attempting to call for governments and non-state actors to enable such access, which in a sense they have the responsibility to do that. So it's really a three-tier, where we can do it ourselves, where we can partner or perhaps engage in remote programming, and then having that advocacy campaign to continue to put the pressure on to obtain that access.
Jules, that's really good. Jeremy, I'd like to hear your thoughts about what Jules just said. That, look, you know, they discuss it inside the organization. They in some ways it's a deliberate compromise not to be able to move towards to be everything, but they don't just accept that. They use advocacy, diplomacy. They are trying to push. Also, they work through other partners. Do you recognize those two strategies? And are there some other strategies that we need to think of when we're trying very, very hard to access those most in need?
Yes, well, here I'd like to develop an idea that that I haven't mentioned during my presentation, but that I hope can kind of answer your question, Mark. And this is the idea that impartiality is about a scale and not a switch, meaning that I think it would be lying to ourselves to think that we can be 100% impartial in every circumstances, that we can just switch on the impartiality button and address all the needs in a relevant manner, according proportionally to their severity or urgency. Rather, it is a scale. So we endeavor to be as impartial as we can be in given circumstances, using the other tools that we have in hands. Some of those tools are those other principles, neutrality, independence, that enable us to be as impartial as we can be. But we do have to use indeed a whole range of different strategies. The ISRC itself regularly resort to what we call humanitarian diplomacy, not advocacy, but it's the same thing, except that we develop this humanitarian diplomacy we privilege bilateral dialogue with all the stakeholders, as you all know well, in order to create the conditions, the possibility to deliver this impartial aid. Sometimes, but those principles, including impartiality, and this is the idea of a scale and not a switch, shouldn't be applied in a too rigid manner. It has to be informed by those other principles. It has to be informed by the context and the specific constraints in a given context. And for instance, in some situations, I mentioned this tension that a kind of a blind application of impartiality could create, and we lived through this in a context like Darfur, for instance, when bringing aid to one particular community, it would create resentment and eventually more problems with neighboring communities. And so we realize that sometimes we have not so much to compromise on those principles, but to adapt those principles to given circumstances. And for instance, some could consider this as a compromise on a strict application of the principle of impartiality, but sometimes you might have to consider bringing some assistance or some services to a population that is maybe less needy than another one, or to develop a clinic in an area where it is less critically needed than in what would be your priority area. But this is also because this is the condition that will enable you to achieve your mission and to deliver this very needed humanitarian aid to the community that is the neediest. But for this, you need to reach also a certain scale as an organization, and I acknowledge that not all organizations might be able to play on those multiple layers. And in that respect, another asset that we have developed within the International Committee of the Red Cross is to be able, precisely as Jules was mentioning, to play at different levels, to play on to provide different type of services, from protection to strengthening, to diffusion on international humanitarian law, to assistance program being veterinary, WATSAN, or food and nutrition, and with this palette of activities that enable us to address the needs wherever they are and to play with those contextual constraints.
Yes, good. Thank you, Jeremy. I think it's really, really interesting what we've come up with here, a number of very pragmatic approaches that deal with, I like your point that, yeah, impartiality is a goal. It's something to aim towards. It's not a black or white, yes, you're impartial, no, you're not. And it is impossible for an organization to be 100% impartial. But that, you know, when an organization is conscious of not being impartial, using advocacy, using partners, using dialogue with other actors, all are ways in which the organization can, let's say, improve on that scale and move towards being a little bit more impartial. I'm going to go to a question that comes in from Amir Kambiz, and what he's asking in some ways is just from a very pragmatic example, what happens when you're in a program in the middle of implementation and then the context changes? And Jeremy, I'd like to start here. You know, you talked about at the level of crisis. So, you know, you're operating somewhere, and then in that same country, maybe there's an earthquake on one side of the country, or maybe war breaks out on, or conflict, or refugees flow to a certain side of the country. So, how are organizations able to deal with that when they already have programming going on? And I think afterwards, that of course brings back into this question, the poll question we had around Haiti as an example, and I think we'll come to you, Jules, afterwards on this.
Right. Well, I think that not all organizations are equal in that respect. It very much depends on, once again, the size of an organization, the skills and the expertise it can provide, which means also its relevance to address specific needs. However, all organizations must be aware, and that's certainly an important responsibility, all organizations must be aware of this idea of complementarity, that other actors that might be better placed than them can address some needs that are not in a position to respond to. Meaning, an organization, in the example you mentioned, an organization that, or actually in the survey that you asked to the participants, you have this this earthquake that happens, and the community that is next to you is more in need. You know this, but you have limited ways to address those needs. Well, you can, but you are aware of them. Then you can certainly advocate with other organizations, coordinate with other organizations to see to raise awareness about those needs, and to maybe to find the one or the organizations that will be able to address those needs. Now, I would like to mention a specific example that hopefully can reply to your question, that happened in the context of the tsunami in 2004 in Sri Lanka. That's where well, the ICRC was present throughout the country, but very much active in the conflict-affected areas in the east and the north of the conflict, where the Tamil Tigers were present at the time. But then we have our natural partner, the Sri Lankan Red Cross, that is present also throughout the country. And the tsunami struck the country. And then we were lucky to have this movement around us that enabled us to basically to distribute the burden within the movement, with the federation that would support the Sri Lankan Red Cross to address the needs arising from the tsunami in areas not directly affected by the conflict, or government-controlled areas, whereas the ICRC, in agreement with our partners from the movement, took the lead of the response in the areas where it was present. So therefore, leveraging the comparative advantages of the different components of this movement, and I believe developing an impartial humanitarian response throughout the country by leveraging this complementarity, basically. So hence the importance of my point on complementarity of actors.
I mean, I certainly don't want to downplay the importance of complementarity, but I'm going to make a critical comment, and that is that it works better in the places where there are lots and lots of actors and an open flow of funding to allow people to do what they do best. But there are so many crises where nobody's going there to the places where people are most in need. And Reza from Jordan comments that there's too many examples of UN and NGOs going for the areas that are safest and easiest to access, but not getting to those areas that are most in need. So I think complementarity is a good answer, but of course, if every organization simply expects other organizations to go, you might end up with nobody going. On that somewhat critical note, I want to go back to Jules on this same kind of question, and take it back to Jules, you work with World Vision, and you have development programs in countries where you've this is essentially the Haiti example from our poll. You have ongoing programming in a country that's not even humanitarian, perhaps, that's development in nature, and then some kind of crisis somewhere else in the country. And how do you treat that? And what are some of the difficulties it creates for you, where you've kind of got a geographic specialization, you might say, where you're working in particular neighborhoods or particular districts, and then something happens somewhere else. And again, it's not easy. It's not the easy answer of let somebody else do it, because there's all these other organizations there. So Jules, if you could just talk a little bit about that dynamic. And then what I'm going to do is go over to Toby and get the other kind of specialization. And that's not necessarily a geographic specialization where you're working in a particular area, but this where you've specialized in particular domains like elderly, like medical, like Watson, and how that plays out. So first to you, Jules, on this.
Thanks, and thanks for taking the easy answer away, complementarity. I think it is a real tension or dilemma that World Vision has faced over the years, and within my career with them, I've seen it on a number of occasions. As some people may or may not know, World Vision is a development, humanitarian, and an advocacy organization, and often our operations start when a disaster occurs, but then we make a commitment to stay for the long haul and implement development programs. So let's say now we're in a place where we've been doing development work, such as Haiti, and a disaster takes place in a locality where we haven't been working. I think first is to understand where we choose where we're working in development, and as we do that, we try to assess in the country where are the most vulnerable people on a normal day and invest our development dollars in those areas. Nevertheless, things shift when radical disasters such as an earthquake of the magnitude we saw take place. And so that puts us into the real importance or criticality of needs assessments. And so needs assessments, I think, are of utmost importance for having a rational objective, or rational objectivity on where you're going to work. It's basically, you can't determine impartiality without actually having evidence about needs. So what World Vision does, and we endeavor to do this as consistently as possible, is engaging in joint needs assessments or coordinated needs assessments with others that are in country. But, and then based on that, where are the greatest needs, who is positioned where to be able to serve that. But let's say that World Vision's in the area where it's not the greatest need, and there's an area that nobody's serving, and we're asked to serve. Well, first, World Vision will take care of its existing constituents. We have a moral obligation to be working with the families and the children that are sponsored by our donors around the world. And it's to assess that they're okay, taken care of, and we get a good scene on that. But then, if we have the capabilities, we certainly will expand our operations into areas where we haven't been. And I've got a couple examples of that. Ethiopia 2000, during that famine or severe food shortage, Ethiopia, World Vision was working in a variety of places, but we hadn't ever started operations in Gode along the Somali border. And I happened to be there, and our president asked us to start operations within 2 weeks and to get that thing going. And we did. And we served that area in the same way that we served our own areas, based on needs assessments and where was the greatest need within those geographic areas. Another example, Chad 2004, World Vision's present in Chad. We weren't working on the border with Sudan. Massive Sudanese out of Darfur cross the border. World Vision opens up operations. Haiti, as we've talked about, we were predominantly in the rural areas outside of the capital, and our communities where we were working started to receive displaced from the cities. So we were working with them along the host communities, but then we opened up operations in Port-au-Prince due to the immense need. And one most recently would be in Mali. World Vision, perhaps 8 years ago, decided we wouldn't work in the north. that we didn't have a comparative advantage and that we would focus in the South. Well, with Boko Haram and everything that's taken place, we had to reassess that. What were the needs? Who was up there? And could we actually add value? And we've reopened up operations in DIFA. So it's a challenge. We have to work through it, seeing really where we can actually add value. And we do look at our existing constituents first, though, in that process. Thanks, Mark.
Jules, let me put you on the spot with that one. When you say you have a moral obligation to your existing constituents, I mean, does that not run counter to the basic principle of impartiality in some ways? I mean, it creates a bit of a bias of who gets your assistance, and that can play out differently, I'm sure, in very different contexts. But it might even play out that it would, in a context that has, for instance, for World Vision, if you're working in a Christian community, it might play out in a bias that it raises some tensions with other communities that aren't Christian in the same country.
Well, I would go back and say assessing the needs of your existing constituents while you're joining in a joint or coordinated assessment of the broader crisis would not indicate a lack of impartiality. So you're doing the needs assessment and you're determining how is the total crisis being handled in an impartial way, and can we contribute to that? And it is a dilemma. But yeah. Let me come back on something else you said there about if we were working in a Christian community. And perhaps that's something we should address as faith-based organizations. I would like to say that World Vision doesn't choose to work in Christian or non-Christian communities. We look to work where the most needs are and where we have access. And I think access and
Hi. It seems we've lost Jules for just a second there. I'm going to go over to you. In some ways, that same question, that was sort of the idea of geographically, you might have a constituency. But we have a question from Michael Gallagher, who has asked, well, does having a targeted group of beneficiaries, for instance, handicapped or children or women or refugees, dilute the principle of impartiality? And I'm asking you, Toby, you've got a targeted group of beneficiaries, the elderly.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and I think it really does boil down to the nature of your target and why. So let me first talk about an example of, if you like, a targeted community which possibly would compromise humanitarian impartiality. There's a really interesting discussion about development leading to humanitarian assistance. Anybody who's worked with the dual mandate organizations, the organizations that have humanitarian as well as development principles, knows that this has gone round the houses for years and years. But what I saw many times working through wonderful local partners is that they, development is about social change. It's about political. It's about politics. It's about being an agent of change. And often the local organizations like Oxfam or Save the Children or ActionAid will want to fund are people who are involved in making change around poverty and equality and equity. And all of a sudden the humanitarian operation comes into those areas, and I have seen very many times that the local partner, what they want to do is to distribute in that existing area. So they the 39% of and it was interesting that 60% of your pollers today came to the same area, stay and deliver in the area where you have established programming. I don't agree if that's your mandate is to be impartial. But for someone like HelpAge or Handicap or Save the Children, this idea about would you continue to pursue your constituency of interest that is based not around a political or a geographical or an economic or an ethnic community, but one of gender, of age, of ability, in the sense of, you know, differently abled people, etc. I think that in this case it's not quite clear. So for HelpAge, we feel that there is a pervasive age discrimination that still goes across the whole humanitarian sector, and therefore we feel that with our very small resources and our very big focus on trying to positively influence the programs of much larger agencies than ourselves, we feel that it's not only not against impartiality to raise the profile of older people in humanitarian emergencies, it's actually a requirement of impartiality, because it's countering people being essentially discriminated against on behalf of their age. And I would offer a creative challenge to my friend or co-panelist who I've never met, Jeremy, to perhaps suggest that it's time the Red Cross introduced age as another one of their markers of, when they say we may make no discrimination on the basis of. Maybe we should all include age. So for us, but there have, I think that's what I'll say for now. I've said what I wanted to say on this.
Toby, thank you for that. I hope people could hear you. There was some breakup in the line. Would you though, just in taking that question a little bit further, you know, we talked, you gave me a really good example yesterday about the example of hypertension. I'll have you explain it. But I guess one of the things that seems fine with this idea of complementarity is that it's good that there are organizations that are specialized and have different expertise. But where do those specializations come from? They don't necessarily come from an assessment of needs on the ground that leads the humanitarian sector to then divide and conquer those needs. It rather seems to relate much more to where funding is available and the way people think about things. So for instance, the way in which we in the West think about children and the much greater ease of obtaining funding for agencies like Save the Children and Plan International and UNICEF, as opposed to funding for elderly. So, you know, complementarity seems to run into, you know, sort of a bias in favor of certain groups or certain people and certain needs. And I'm wondering if you might comment on that.
And I took great pride in their nutrition and their education and their protection responses that were very aimed at kids. But it is true that there is a clear bias towards younger age cohorts than older age cohorts in humanitarian assistance. HelpAge is the only specialist agency looking at the inclusion of older people in development and humanitarian crises, and our global size financially is about the size of a sort of small to mid-size country program for one of these sort of meta charities now, like Save or Care or World Vision. Just to give a very practical real life example, I mean, I wonder how many people I'm sorry, I should have made a poll about this, but undiagnosed hypertension, high blood pressure, which is the risk of which rises with age, is today responsible for more preventable death, serious disability, loss of functionality, and all of that implies to a person and all of their family, than all of the infectious disease caseload of the world combined. I visited in January the some refugee sites in Lebanon, in Beirut and in the Bekaa, and $1 billion of humanitarian assistance has been spent in Lebanon, which is a very good thing. But and there were more than one, while I was there, the milestone of an estimated 1 million refugees in Lebanon was reached. And we did a joint program with Médecins du Monde and Amel, the Lebanese partner, and it was opening specialist clinics where older people would come in and present with the disease of the elderly, which was high blood pressure and diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes. And we were the only clinics across the whole of the humanitarian system that were specifically making consultation times available for older people and inviting them and testing and prescribing easy treatments. The global humanitarian endeavor has for years and years been organized around the sort of simple moral power of this idea that humanitarian assistance is about the provision of low-cost, proven interventions that save lives. Why do we not provide blood pressure testing, medicine for hypertension, treatment for type 2 diabetes, which every day are out there taking thousands and thousands of lives preventably because of age discrimination, because of a lack of impartiality?
Thank you, Toby, for making that point very clearly. I mean, I myself would also have to add that, I remember the experience of MSF when it started to get into some of the camps in the Middle East crises, and it's a different set of needs, the medical needs of the people are not the same as you might find, let's say, in an IDP camp in Eastern Congo or in Southern Sudan. Jules, technology cut you off right in the middle of a very critical point. So I'd like to come back to you so you can make that point. But then I want to get at what you've mentioned before, and that is assessment. And I think
so much.
as I just said, has something to do with why as a humanitarian community we might
friend
miss
and our
something
enemy.
like hypertension.
So let me maybe come back into what I was going to say by just
so first, Jules, if you want to just come back on what you were
Jeremy
saying
had
before
said
you
in
were
the
cut off.
beginning, at some level, that impartiality seems close to being an absolute principle like humanity. And it's back to somewhat of what you were asking me about, is World Vision being partial when we stay and look at the communities where we already exist. And I would say, I don't actually recall a situation when World Vision has ever compromised on the principle of impartiality, particularly at a programming level. And it gets more difficult, I think, at a crisis level. We talked a little bit about that with Syria. And then how does World Vision manage it at a global level? That's challenging because resources do impinge and constrain our ability to be everywhere. And we can maybe talk about that more. However, in the circumstances where I say we haven't compromised on impartiality, we have, I would say, compromised on independence and neutrality for the purpose of upholding the humanitarian imperative or prioritizing the principle of humanity. And I think Hugo Slim refers to humanity as the trump card. And as, but how do we make those decisions? And that's something I wanted to just mention, is that we have a tool that we created called HISCAM, which is to assist us in making these difficult decisions. It provides a structure and a record of how we resolve or work through the dilemmas like we're talking about here today. And it's an attempt to bring greater consistency within the organization on how we approach these dilemmas. And it helps us consider the cost benefits associated with those compromises versus the pragmatic choices. And I'd like to say that principles and pragmatism can coexist, and in fact, they need to coexist because we can't do one without the other in the real world. So now let me go to the religion part where it seemed like God intervened, and maybe I shouldn't speak to this because that's when the technology went out. But I'd like to say that most religions or faiths, I believe, uphold the principle of humanity, and that all human life is equal and precious, and therefore embraces the principle of impartiality. And impartiality is basically a bottom line. And I think we see this in Buddhism, where impartiality is one of 7 factors to the attainment of enlightenment. It's also one of the 4 sublime states, as I understand it, which are thought to be prerequisite skills for rebirth. And as somebody who's a Christian that works with a faith-based organization, I would say as Christians, we're actually radically impartial. We regard all people as created and loved by God, and we have a foundational belief that human beings are equal. In a sense, we're programmed this way. And so I think living out the love of God requires us helping the most vulnerable and really insists on impartiality. And maybe my last point on this would be somebody once shared a phrase. It said, consideration for all, courtesy to all, compassion for all, and consistency in all. And I think we as humanitarians ought to keep this at the front of our minds as a reminder when we deal with these dilemmas. Thanks, Mark.
No, I want to emphasize that, Jules, because that's something we've been talking about all along in this series, and that is, it comes back to what Jeremy talked about. This is compliance with these principles is not a switch. And I think what's really important, and the point we want to keep making, is that when organizations do compromise, or even not compromise, just have discussions about whether to, how to give these principles meaning, it's important that they're deliberate. And I think what you just talked about, of using a tool to structure it, to create a sense of consistency in these decisions over time, and also to create a record of them. You know, to be able to look back and say, why weren't we in that area? Well, we took a decision and we weren't able to go there for the following reasons. And I think that element of deliberation is you know, I think that's a requirement that want to be able to say, we might not be 100% impartial, but we are complying with impartiality, and that there's a difference there. Jeremy, with that, I'd like to come back to you. You know, when we talk about these matters, one of the things that Jules was talking about is that difference between what they do at a local level and a crisis level, and the difficulties, for instance, when you look at across the globe at the places where we're not. And I always find that question very interesting for impartiality. Where, you know, who is not here? If you're at the project level, you're in a project, you're very busy, and sometimes teams forget to stick their head up every now and then and ask, who's not coming here? Who aren't we seeing? And at the same time, at the global level, even organizations that are very, very busy,
yes,
say,
well,
where are we not active? Where are there people in need beyond this? And I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Is that something that you guys do in the ICRC on a regular basis?
The question he asked to me earlier in the discussion is the area of detention, the work that the ICRC does in prisons, in places of detention. That's just one example. But when oh, sorry, my screen went off. Can you hear me? Okay, so it was just my screen that went off, but not the sound. Sorry. So yes, indeed, in the area of detention, which is part of our protection activities, we
yes, you're doing fine, Jeremy. We hear you fine.
Interactions we had with organizations such as Help Age over the years, we came to realize that indeed we in our daily activities, we were missing some particularly vulnerable categories of the population. And I'm talking about maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when we had maybe a less sophisticated understanding of our action and somehow a bit less professional. And through the years and with the contact with various organizations such as Help Age, such as the UNICEF or Save the Children, or organizations working specifically on women needs, we improved in our own practice of impartiality. And I think that we have to recognize this, that it is an ideal that we have to strive to achieve, but we have to recognize that none of us are even close to it. And so to come back to the area of detention, the protection work we do in places of detention, we came to realize that some categories of prisoners were kind of ignored, and so we came to develop a much more holistic approach, and which is almost common sense. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a box that you have to tick on an assessment form, but what our delegates are asked to do when they enter in a cell is to look around them and to see whether there are some categories of prisoners that are not coming to you, to whom you are not speaking. And so, for instance, this guy who sits in the corner at the back while you have this kind of a group discussion with all the other inmates, what are the specific needs of this guy? Or indeed, of elderly people or children. And so I guess my point here is to say that this is, well, first, through this contact with more specialized agencies whom I believe can be impartial. It's not because they are specialized that they cannot be impartial, but it is through their contact also that more generalist organizations are also able to develop this increased awareness of some specific vulnerabilities that we might not have fully taken into account to start with. I'm not sure it fully answers your question. Does it, Mark?
No, it answers a part of it, but let me be a little bit more specific. I'm going to take a comment from Antonio, who's in Geneva, and he says, it seems to me that power is missing from the discussion here, and that the global war on terror, anti-terror legislation, donor pet projects, we know that some donors would have money specific for refugees or for other groups. Does all of that not fundamentally undermine impartiality?
Yes, certainly. Certainly, that's, and I think, I believe I mentioned it in my presentation. We are, this is a constant challenge to implement impartial humanitarian action, because we have to deal with conflicting political priorities. We have to deal with funding, financial limitations. We have to deal with actors who brandish the flag of humanitarianism to carry out some other objectives, as I mentioned, which is to stabilize some fragile societies, to support states against some non-state actors, and we have to deal with all those constraints, and I believe this is why we have those other principles that are also guiding our action to enable us to strive to be as impartial as we can be. And this is why, for instance, within the ICRC, we do have a limited financial reserve, but a reserve that nonetheless enable us to develop a quick response to suddenly emerging needs without being entirely dependent on well, doing an appeal or waiting for donors to unlock some money, and we have developed this relatively small and limited financial resource in those specific instances, for planning for those specific instances where we want to be able to have this financial independence, to free ourselves from those political or economic or whatever constraints in order to deliver this impartial aid. But obviously, power is part of the equation.
No, thank you, Jeremy. Toby, I would like to come to you with in some ways that same question, and I'm going to bend it a little bit because I think obviously, as Antonio says, you know, the major donors use their influence, and they have their interests, and funding flows, you know, in line with those interests. I would argue that that's what independence tells us, that if you want to be impartial, an organization needs to be independent, and that can mean also to build a certain amount of financial independence, so that if donors aren't providing funding to go to a particular area, that that the organization would still be able to do that. And I'm wondering if, Toby, for you, does the same thing apply to areas of expertise? You know, is it good enough that agencies say, well, you know what, we really don't know much about the medical conditions of the elderly, so we'll leave that for others? Is that good enough, or is that something that impartiality requires an agency to deal with? Because it's not like the elderly are a rare, you know, a rare phenomenon. They're everywhere. Where how do you think about that? Should agencies actually be developing much more specialized programming for the elderly, the way we have for children, for gender issues and things like that?
Just the fact that main
No, I can tell you that certainly inside MSF, within the medical expertise, we would very much look to have people who were specialists in child health. And, you know, for a great number of the diseases that we worked with, for instance, tuberculosis and many other diseases, even the diagnosis and the prescription and how much of a particular medicine you would use, those protocols didn't exist for children. So we had to put resources on it to actually develop them. So, you know, I do think there are agencies that do that, but go ahead, back to you.
Pediatrics and infectious disease control and so on. And I think given that by the currently 15% of the world's population is age 60 or over, by 2050 that population will rise to 25%. So it's clearly not acceptable if you've got a generalist medical mandate not to be able to diagnose and offer basic treatment for the diseases of any significant segment of the population like that. The issue that you mentioned about financial independence, it's a very difficult one. It's a very relevant one. MSF has a wonderful business model in terms of how it, if you like, makes independence one of the values of the organization, that links not just how it seeks to operate at field level but also uses the undoubted moral good of MSF maintaining its independence as a powerful argument for individual donors to be part of the MSF movement and to support it in a way that allows it to maintain an overall financial majority for funds given by members of the public. It's a great model. There are very few other large, I guess World Vision would be another very good example of World Vision. I think gets a lot of restricted funding, but has obviously an enormous constituency of support around the world that obviously empower it to act with legitimacy in certain ways. But for the majority of agencies, even the very largest ones, they're always having to work with governments, and therefore inevitably our programs will, grosso modo reflect the global priorities of the biggest donors to humanitarian assistance at the time. And I think, one of the things which I think is quite exciting about the World Humanitarian Summit is one of the themes that's emerging in terms of recognition of sort of shifting the responsibility of the financing of the humanitarian system, shifting it more broadly in a global perspective. And what that might well lead to is a greater resilience for physical humanitarian action to be directed and concentrated by political and other non-humanitarian reasons of our major current donors, because currently humanitarian assistance is there's still a tiny handful of donors who are responsible for a great majority of global humanitarian endeavor.
It's a good point in terms of the World Humanitarian Summit. This issue of financial independence is very much tied into the impartiality of organizations in terms of their ability to be able to get somewhere. Jules, I'm going to come back to you. And in fact, I'm very conscious of the time. It's 4 o'clock here in London, and that is the time we have scheduled. We're going to go a little bit over that. I want to make a round. I'm going to get to everybody again. And I want to make a round around on the topic of assessment, because you raised that, and I think it's a really key issue that we haven't yet brought into the discussion, and that is you need to be able to see the needs. I'm guessing that many organizations would collect data, for instance, that does not disaggregate according to age, and so therefore might not even recognize that they were for instance, not seeing elderly in their clinic, or that they were seeing a predominance of elderly in their clinic, meaning that the elderly had greater needs if they were running a health program. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, how does World Vision go about, making sure that it's collecting the right data? Because of course you can overdo it. You can have every little religious group, every gender breakdown, age breakdowns, all kinds of things, geographic breakdowns thrown into your data collection, and then you're just producing mountains and mountains of unusable data. On the other hand, if you don't see and disaggregate, for instance, according to gender, you will never recognize some of the very real ways in which crisis plays out and has, crisis itself has a discriminatory impact on elderly, on certain ethnic groups, on religious groups, and how does World Vision
as a child-focused organization falls into this dilemma of the specialty of assessments, and maybe in doing so you can miss out on the bigger picture of other needs. And even if we're looking at specific child protection needs, we could miss out on the broader protection issues of a community. And children live in communities. They're part of families. And so World Vision endeavors to really be part of the broader coordinated needs assessments, or the joint needs assessments that the humanitarian country teams are working to launch. And I think a key point that I'd like to raise here as we look at the World Humanitarian Summit, and this gets to perhaps also impartially as a goal globally, where it's difficult to attain, is how do we assess needs and then invest, which gets to the financial independence part as well. I think some folks are talking about the need to perhaps create independent needs assessments from operations. So how do we consolidate needs assessments, and then put that forward to all the various agencies that bring their complementary skill sets, whether it's HelpAge, World Vision with child particular issues, the demining groups, etc., to where we ensure to the greatest possibility impartiality comprehensively within the context of a crisis. And I think we need to look at that more, and some recommendations have been made within the summit context. Another piece here, I think, is increasing investment in pooled funds. And potentially, although this is a little bit more difficult, and that is supporting the issue of assessed contributions for humanitarian action. So you get a comprehensive assessment, you then put that out to those that have the special capabilities, we harness those, and then you use assessed contributions to ensure the resourcing to respond to the greatest needs is available.
Thank you, Jules. Let me just ask you a specific question based a little bit on a situation Morag is talking about in Iraq, and that is, you've got Sunnis and Shias. Would you record in any way for instance, the ethnic or religious background
it's a difficult question.
of beneficiaries
if you're really
in your
looking
programming
at
to make sure that you
and if we're being
were
impartial,
sort of
it is
distributing your aid
independent of their
in a
ethnic
balanced
group.
way.
So actually, we shouldn't be assessing what ethnic group they come from. Maybe I can speak to in Central African Republic, World Vision at some level was accused of not being impartial because where we're working predominantly now are in Muslim areas, but that's where we have access. And we didn't go there because of that. It's because it's where the greatest needs were and where we've been able to have access. So again, impartiality ensures and guides our compassion with some rational objectivity.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It raises the issue that Jeremy made earlier, and that is that, you were acting in accordance to impartiality, but the perception on the other side is perhaps that you're not being neutral, and that's just one of these very we have to talk about and just fight through on the ground. Toby, how about you in terms of assessment tools? You've been around humanitarian organizations. Do they even see the elderly in their assessment of needs?
I think that people are becoming more aware. I like to think that HelpAge has a positive impact on that increased awareness. Paradoxically, the skill, as you yourself has written in some of your blogs, is learning to see people who you might not see in front of you, if you like, and learning to understand that there might be a segment of population who's not able to fight their way to the front of a needs assessment to talk to or to a distribution. So I think that on some of the policy successes, I think a lot of the more serious international donors, the ones that we all think about, sector leaders, OFDA, ECHO, DFID, have all over the last couple of years made commitments to stepping up their requirements to see needs assessments reflecting age and disability. I'd just like to introduce a final point into the works, but I was on a recent high-level panel set up by DFID to look at the use of cash and humanitarian cash transfers, and our report was launched in London last week and in Brussels at the 30th of September. The then Director General of ECHO, Klaus Sorensen, was on the panel. Lindy Cameron, who oversees the UK government's humanitarian assistance, Jan Egeland, was there. And one of the things that we realized is that if you imagine the future of humanitarianism, what I would like to see 10 or 15 years into the future is a much greater use of cash or other electronic payment systems, whereby if you're a Help Age or a Save the Children or a World Vision, you might simply be directing your resources through a efficient system like that, and the registration would have established, well, there's an older person in this household, there are kids in that household, and the amount of cash that they would receive and why they received it would be changed, but without, and I think that technology will allow humanitarian assistance to go much further, which of course answers another one of the challenges we've been discussing today, which is there's never enough to go round. So that's just a last curveball to throw into this debate, is that this idea of single mandate agencies saying, well, I'm going to have my programs for kids, other people will have their programs for older people, for pregnant women, for lactating mums. If we can make the global humanitarian assistance more efficient and more effective through electronic cash payment systems, we can all disrupt ourselves out of business.
That's back on your optimistic note there. Jeremy, I'd like to one last time. And in particular, we've got a question from Joanna in Malta, who's asking about the tools used by the ICRC, for instance, to look at impartiality on these three different levels that you've talked about. And Jules has just talked about it, within World Vision. And what about you? How does ICRC look at those three different levels?
Not an easy question.
What kind of assessments do you conduct?
It's a question that cannot call for an easy answer. How do we try to secure and assess impartiality at all those three different levels? Well, I mentioned this financial reserve. Maybe that's one example of how and one tool to ensure this global impartiality. Then it's not an easy answer, because how do we secure impartiality at all those three levels? Well, it is, I would say, throughout all or most of our policy. Oh,
Yeah. But how do you assess it, Jeremy? So,
I'm sorry to
but how do you assess it? How do you even judge where you should be?
Assessment and the question of disaggregated data. I'm afraid I'm not the best person to respond, because indeed I'm not quite sure how the latest assessment forms that we might use in health or in the nutrition area are looking like. But well, that's a tough question you're asking me, Mark. But certainly, how do we? As I said, it's throughout the policies of the institution in the different areas of work, like protection, assistance, through the policy guidelines that we have, that we try to secure this impartiality. I mentioned the area of protection, for instance. We do have guidelines for the protection of civilians, for instance, that ask us, when assessing a particular incident, for instance, like let's say a burnt village somewhere, and who were the victims and how it happened, that those guidelines ask us to look at those different categories of people that might have been affected, impacted by such an incident. And I guess this is how we try to implement, secure this impartiality. And then one other point that I would like to say, I believe it's also not all about data, but as I mentioned before, it's about listening and talking to all. It's about having this human relationship. Data are important. Disaggregated data are certainly very important and enable us to be more relevant to people's needs. But it's also about listening to them, sitting with the community leader, but also with women in this particular community, hearing the voice of the children as much as possible. And so it is also about knowledge and about analysis of those contexts.
Very important point by Jeremy to finish up there. I don't want to summarize, but I just want to say a few things that I've heard over and over again, and that is, it's extremely important to look at on those three levels and ask ourselves, you know, where aren't we? Where should we be? But at the same time, even where we are, who's not here? And to be able to make that and decide, are there people who aren't coming? And why? And to look into it. Secondly, that the independence of the organization has a lot to do with whether we're able to react to people impartially, and that is a security management independence. It's financial independence. It's the expertise of being able to deal with, for instance, the problems of the elderly, and it's looking at new issues. Toby raised a. I want to say one final thing is just to emphasize Jules' point about, you know, the deliberate nature of, you know, as Jeremy said, this is not a switch, this is a scale, and to always be trying to push the organization and to deliberate within the organization about how it can become more impartial, and to really, you know, write down in a consistent fashion the decisions that are taken that where impartiality is not possible. With that, I think I will turn to our final slides, and that is just to say that first, this event, we've been discussing the practical dilemmas of the core humanitarian principles. As mentioned, today's discussion was part of a series of events on the humanitarian principles, and I hope you'll join us for the next discussions as well. For our next event is on October 1st, and we'll be looking at depth more in depth. As today on impartiality, we're going to take the principle of neutrality for that discussion. That's Thursday, October 1st. And then after that, on Tuesday is the end of this series, and that's going to be independence on Tuesday, October 6th. Lastly, but that's not the end of the discussion on the humanitarian principles. And after discussing in this series, we at PHAP are very happy to offer an opportunity to look further at the principles in daily operations, together with the Norwegian Refugee Council and Handicap International. The date for that is October 8th, and in short, what they've done is they've commissioned field research on this very topic that we're discussing in this series. With the title of Principles and Pragmatism in Conflict Settings, Perspectives from the Field, NRC and Handicap International sent a team of experts in August to Colombia, South Sudan, Nepal, and Turkey, and for Turkey it was to look at the situation in Syria, in order to explore these very questions within those contexts. In other words, to look at the challenges and the influence of the principles in real time in those countries. So really hope that you'll be able to join that. I would say don't miss it. Finally, as we come to the end of this, I would like to give a big round of applause. So a special thanks to our speakers. First to Toby and to Jules, but also to Jeremy, who also contributed such an interesting and clear learning session. And of course, a thank you to all of you for your participation. There were a lot of good comments. I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them, but we've tried to get to some of them. So best of luck to everyone in their work, and hope to see you next time. You can see on your screen the links that you need to come back to this. And everyone have a great day.